It began with a silence that felt heavier than gunpowder. The year was 1776, and across the American colonies, the air trembled with a question no one dared speak aloud until the moment they could no longer avoid it. Had the time finally come to break away from the most powerful empire on earth? Or were they about to ignite a fire that would consume everything they had ever known? In Philadelphia, the city moved like a restless animal, wagons rattling, church bells echoing, whispers carrying through taverns and narrow streets. People sensed that something extraordinary was building, something larger than the skirmishes at Lexington or the blood spilled on Bunker Hill. The colonies were no longer merely protesting. They were drifting toward a decision that could reshape the world. Inside the halls of the Second Continental Congress, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Delegates argued, paced, slammed fists onto wooden tables. For months, they had pleaded for reconciliation with Britain, sending petitions and letters across the Atlantic, each one answered with more troops, more restrictions, more threats. King George III had already declared the colonies in open rebellion. The rebellion, was that all they wanted? Or was the truth even more dangerous? The suspense of those days clung like smoke to the rafters. No one felt it more than John Adams. He moved tirelessly from delegate to delegate, voice hoarse, eyes burning with conviction. He believed independence was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. But he also knew he was fighting not just against British power, but against American fear. Many colonies still hesitated. Independence meant war without the hope of Britain's mercy. It meant risking everything: land, family, life itself. Yet something unexpected arrived that winter, something that cut through hesitation like the swing of an axe. A small pamphlet, cheaply printed, passed from hand to hand like forbidden treasure. Common Sense, it was called, written by a man who had been unknown just a year earlier, Thomas Paine. His words cracked open the minds of ordinary people and elite leaders alike. Paine spoke boldly, fearlessly, accusing kings of tyranny, insisting that a distant island should never rule a continent. He mocked the very idea of monarchy, as though it were an absurd joke the world had been forced to endure for far too long. The pamphlet spread like wildfire, read aloud in taverns, carried across frozen rivers, discussed by farmers around flickering hearths. It transformed nerves into determination. It gave the colonies a language for the rebellion they felt, but could not yet articulate. Suddenly, independence did not seem like treason. It seemed like destiny. Still, destiny must be claimed, and the path to claiming it was shadowed by conflict. When Congress finally agreed to debate independence openly, the room filled with tension sharp as a drawn blade. Some men feared the economic collapse that might follow. Others trembled thinking of British ships gathering along their coasts. But Adams stood, voice rising with the force of a storm, declaring that the colonies were already at war, already targets of British fury. "We are in the very midst of revolution," he insisted. "Why pretend otherwise?" And slowly, one by one, hesitant voices softened. Doubts cracked. Resolution shifted. Then, in early June, the moment came. Congress voted to begin drafting a formal declaration, words that would announce to the world that the colonies were no longer colonies. They were something new, something untried, something bold enough to challenge an empire. A committee of 5 was chosen, but everyone knew the real burden would fall on the quiet, introspective delegate from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. He was young, reserved, often silent in debates, but gifted with a pen that could cut through confusion and speak straight to the human spirit. Jefferson withdrew to a small rented room on Market Street, the shutters pulled low, the city noise muted beyond the glass. There, with only a few books for reference and his thoughts burning like a restrained fire, he began to write. He wrote of equality, though the world around him was far from equal. He wrote of rights given not by kings or parliaments, but by nature itself. He wrote of grievances so severe they left no path but separation. But above all, he wrote with the awareness that every sentence might lead his people either to freedom or to the gallows. Night slipped away as his quill scratched across parchment. When he delivered the first draft to the committee, his expression held a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The others made revisions, crossing out lines, smoothing phrasing, strengthening arguments. Adams and Franklin offered suggestions, sometimes teasing Jefferson for his sensitivity toward edits. But even through revisions, the heart of the document, the soul of it, remained Jefferson's. As June turned to July, Congress sealed itself in debate once more. Outside, the heat lay heavy on Philadelphia, but inside, the air burned with something hotter: fear, hope, and the weight of history pressing down on every man seated there. Delegates argued over each line, each accusation against the king. They trimmed passages, polished others, until finally, after 3 intense days, the document stood ready. Then came the vote. On July 2, 1776, the colonies voted for independence. The decision was not greeted with cheering, but with a somber silence. They all understood the enormity of what they had done. They had thrown aside the protection of the world's mightiest empire. They had made themselves enemies of Britain. There was no turning back. But it wasn't July 2nd the world would remember. 2 days later, on July 4th, the final language of the Declaration was approved. The parchment lay on the table like something alive, the ink still faintly shimmering. As the delegates stepped forward to sign, there was no drum roll, no fanfare, only the creaking of floorboards, the scratch of quills, the breathlessness of men aware that by writing their names, they were signing their own death warrants should the war end in defeat. John Hancock signed first, his name bold and sweeping large enough, he joked, that the king could read it without his spectacles. Others followed more quietly. But each signature felt like a blow struck for a new world. Outside, the streets slowly filled with rumor, then confirmation. Bells began to ring, hesitant at first, then louder. Soldiers gathered, citizens crowded into squares, printers rushed to produce copies through the night. When the Declaration was read aloud for the first time to the public, cheers erupted, hats were thrown into the air, and tears streamed down faces. Ordinary men and women farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, felt the earth shift beneath their feet. They were no longer subjects. They were something more. But not everywhere did the news bring celebration. In Britain, the reaction was a mixture of fury and disbelief. Many political leaders scoffed at the audacity of the colonies. Others warned that the empire faced a long, brutal conflict. King George III saw the Declaration not as a statement of grievances, but as an unforgivable act of rebellion. Britain prepared for war with a force and determination meant to crush every spark of American defiance. Back across the ocean, the colonies themselves were divided. Some embraced independence with fiery passion. Others trembled at the thought of what might come next. For Loyalists, the Declaration felt like a betrayal. For enslaved people, it read like a promise that did not yet include them. For native nations, it signaled an uncertain and dangerous future. And yet, despite fears and fractures, a powerful truth settled across the land. The colonies had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They had spoken their intent to the world, and the world was listening. As night fell on July 4th, Philadelphia glowed with lanterns and the distant crackle of celebration. But inside the minds of the men who had signed the Declaration, there was no rest. They knew the hardest part was yet to come. The British Army was vast, disciplined, relentless. The American forces were exhausted, poorly supplied, outnumbered. Independence had been declared with ink. Now it would have to be secured with blood. Still, in that fragile, uncertain moment, hope flickered. The document they had created held a power no musket could match, the power of ideas. Ideas that would travel far beyond the colonies, beyond the century. reshaping nations and inspiring countless others to demand freedom. The suspense of what would come next hung over the land like an approaching storm. But one thing was undeniable. A new world had begun to take shape, and it all started with words written in a small room, debated in a sweltering hall, signed by men who risked everything, and proclaimed to the world on that unforgettable day, July 4th, 1776.